The key killer, thank motherfucking little Rasa killer, nigga.
Welcome to Boys in the Hood TV. Today we're tapping into the streets of Chicago. We're going to be talking about a Chicago shooter, a chiraq demon, known as Luis Contreras, aka Snoop, from the Almighty Saints. Now the Almighty Saints history stems all the way back to the 60s in the back of the yard neighborhood. And decades later, they will become one of the most violent gangs in the city of Chicago. Now, over the years and decades, the Saints will go to war with gangs like the Latin Kings, the 2-2 Boys, the Latin Souls, 2-6s, and Satan Disciples. Now, in the late 2010s, the Almighty Saints will have a very violent war with the Satan Disciples. And a lot of the murders that we're going to discuss in this video are part of that war. Now, Luis Contreras, aka Snoop, a known chief from 45th, will be one of the main Saints that stood on the front line when it came to any war. Now, the other Saints that had a violent reputation were Chino, Goofy, and Butcher. Now, Snoop will be accused of allegedly having nearly 6 bodies attached to his name, but the feds could only prove one, and that one body is the one that Snoop actually admitted to. Now, one of his very first bodies, Leticia Barrera. On Halloween in 2007, Barrera was returning home after taking her 3 kids trick-or-treating. Barrera, who was 4 months pregnant at the time, stayed on the 4800 block of South Sealy Avenue, which is the 2-6 neighborhood, a known rival to the Saints. As Barrera exited her vehicle with her 3 children, a vehicle pulled up with members of the Saints. Inside was 18-year-old Orlando Abuela, aka Little Paulina, along with another Saint member named Rubio. Now, the feds allege that Snoop sent both shooters to 47th and Damon to kill members of the 2-6s. Now, moments later, these 2 Saint shooters would open fire on the block. Barrera would attempt to cover her 3 children from the hail of gunfire as it passed by, but sadly, she was struck with 1 fatal shot to her head. Immediately, the Saints fled the scene, and Barrera would die from her injuries. But eventually, witnesses would come forward to identify Orlando as the shooter, which included a man by the name of Reyes, who Orlando allegedly told about the murders. Now, after this, Orlando will be arrested weeks later and eventually be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 65 years in prison. Now, 2 years later, after this murder, Snoop will be arrested by the feds for selling handguns to an undercover ATF agent. Now, the feds at the time knew that he had his hands in the murder of Barrera, but they did not have enough evidence to charge him. But he will be charged with selling guns to an undercover ATF agent, and he will be sentenced to 8 years in prison. Now, after serving his time, Snoop will be getting out of prison, and the war between the Satan Disciples was in full effect, and at the time, bodies were already dropping. And before you know it, Snoop will be once again involved in another murder. On August 16, 2017, a Satan Disciple member named Javier Pantoja, aka Lazy, who was standing next to his car on 60th Street in Satan City, when allegedly Snoop pulled up in a tan-color vehicle and opened fire. Now, Lazy was hit multiple times in the hail of gunfire, sending him collapsing to the ground as Snoop fled the scene. When officers arrived, they would find Lazy dead near his car. Now, only 4 months later, another Satan Disciple body would drop, allegedly at the hands of Snoop. On December 17th, Satan Disciple member Frankie Baez and Jasmine Chavez and Jose Gonzalez were riding on 59th and Mozart deep in Disciple Murder Town set. At around 9:40 p.m., allegedly Almighty Saint Snoop creeped up on the block and stood on the sidewalk. He waited for Frankie's vehicle to go by, and that's when he aimed his rifle and opened fire. All 3 in the car were hit multiple times as the car came to a halt. The cops would arrive shortly later to find the car riddled with bullets. Frankie and Jasmine were both pronounced dead at the scene, but Jose Gonzalez was only wounded and will be transported to the hospital and would survive his injuries. Now, weeks after this murder, another body will drop at the start of the year. On January 27, 2018, Thomas Hernandez will be riding through the 5900 block of Springfield at 2 a.m. when once again, Almighty Saint Snoop pulled up next to him and started blasting. Hernandez tried to drive away, but was hit multiple times including shots to his head, causing him to crash his car into a parked vehicle. Now, by the time the cops arrived, they found Hernandez dead behind the steering wheel with the engine still running. Nearly 3 weeks later, on February 18th, at around 5 a.m., a known Satan disciple named Andre Franzel and another man sat parked in a car on the 7700 block of Kilbourne, when allegedly Snoop, along with other Almighty Saints, pulled up on the block. As the Saints drove near the driveway, Snoop rolled down the window and opened fire on Andre. Multiple gunshots tore through the vehicle, hitting both Andre and the passenger. Immediately, the Saints pulled off, but sometime later the police would arrive on scene to find Andre unconscious behind the wheel. EMTs would rush him to the hospital, where he would be pronounced dead. Now, the second victim, who was in the car with Andre, would later be discovered with a gunshot wound to the foot, but he would survive this injury. Now, with these multiple bodies, Snoop's reign of terror on the streets of Chicago was not quite over just yet. According to the feds, they believe he had his hands tied in the murder of a gangster disciple named Kendall Brown, aka KB. On August 5th, at around 1 a.m., KB was walking on the 4800 block of Winchester when a white Jeep, driven by Snoop, drove past and started blasting. KB was hit multiple times in his abdomen and his ankle. When the police and EMTs arrived, he was immediately transported to the hospital, and by 1:54 a.m., KB was pronounced dead. Now, around the same time, the fire department will get a call about a vehicle which had been set on fire on the 4300 block of Paulina. Detectives would later discover that it was the same vehicle used in the murder of Kendall Brown. Now, 2 months after the murder of Kendall Brown, in October, Almighty Saint Snoop will be arrested along with other saints on federal charges of racketeering, which included murder. Now, during his arrest, agents would find a handgun along with 2 rifles. Now, in 2022, Snoop would take a plea deal where he admitted that he was a member of the Almighty Saints and that he did engage in drug dealing and violence, which included murder. Snoop would go on to admit the killing of Andre Franzel for the benefit of the Saints gang. Now, during this case, the state would bring up the other alleged bodies, but Snoop's attorney would address those bodies and state that at this late date, the defense counsel has no reasonable opportunity to scrutinize or investigate this information or how it may relate to Mr. Contreras. The allegations are tenuous at best. The state would also bring up the murder of Kendall Brown due to the fact that shell casings from Brown's murder asserted correlation to the rifles that were seized during Snoop's arrest. Eventually, Luis Contreras will be sentenced to 35 years in prison. Currently, to this day, he is serving out his sentence at the Big Sandy Federal State Pen. I'd like to thank everybody for tapping in, and I'll see y'all next time.